Okay, so let's get back to the rest of the class. And what we want to do now is we want to see how to basically retrieve init parameters, but this time inside our JSP. Okay, it might sound a little bit odd because this parameters are called servlet config init parameters, and we want to use JSP, so it might sound odd. But if you recall the life cycle of JSP, you will immediately learn that this is quite normal because at the end of the day, JSP will be converted into a servlet. So let me now find where the JSP file went. Oh, it's here. And we named it correctly. So I'm gonna go here, and what I can do is I can copy some codes from here because the codes are going to be very similar with a little exception, because we have implicit objects in JSP. So, and also I'm gonna use scriptlets just to copy the information here. We will need enumeration, and we can just import it here. If you remember, import directive, import equals java.util.enumeration. Okay, so we have this one here now, it's fine. And actually this config is an implicit object in JSP, so I don't need to create an object from it. And also we don't, we have JSP here, so I can simply say out.println, so we can display things on the browser this time. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a BR element to make the presentation a bit nicer. BR. Anything else needs to change? I think everything is fine now. All right, so let's go ahead. This time we use different parameters for our JSP. We change the names. Just keep in mind that instead of servlet class, we have JSP file. All right, so now let's go ahead, and this time I'm going to run this. Let's see what happens. Okay, so don't be surprised to see these parameters because these are the default parameters for JSP. You can't really change that. And also this one here. Okay, so these are the default parameters that are set by the system. But you can see that here we have our parameters, which is the first name and the surname. Okay, so if you have any questions, let me know. We will have more to talk about, to discuss about servlets, other kinds of parameters, and also JDBC. So we just saw the demonstration here. We saw how to use these methods in order to retrieve our init parameters. Okay. Get init parameter takes an argument, which is the name of the init parameters. So we just saw this demo live. We don't need to go through these codes again, but if you want to run this at home, you can use these slides. When the container initializes the servlet, we discussed this during the life cycle of servlet. The container creates an object, but still we don't have a servlet, and then the container is going to call the init. And at this point, this is when the servlet gets the servlet config object. Okay. So the container, what the container does, it reads all the information from web.xml file or deployment descriptor, and it in some way it copies the information inside the servlet config object. So the content of web.xml file for particular servlets will be stored inside this object. So as long as you have access to servlet config, you have access to the parameters inside your servlet config, those parameters that are defined for a particular servlet. And finally, the container passes the servlet config to the init method. So we have two versions of init method. One is without an argument, one is with a servlet config argument. So these are the few steps of how container basically reads the information in web.xml and stores them and passes them to your servlet. Creating a new servlet config, creating a name and value, because if you remember, every parameter will have a name and a value. It gives the servlet config reference to name and value, and creates a new instance of the servlet class. So we still don't have a running servlet, full-fledged servlet, because once the init method is called, then we will have the full-fledged servlet. We also saw the answer to this question. So we saw by going to web.xml, we can actually provide the name for the JSP by using JSP file element, which is, where is it? Here. Okay. So by using a JSP file tag, we learned how to actually access init parameters from our JSP. So again, this code is available to you if you want to recreate it at home. You can go through these steps that tells you how to retrieve init parameters from your JSP. So it's clearly marked out, everything for you. So as you can see that there are some system parameters, you don't actually control them. So if you're displaying init parameters from JSP, you will see some parameters that you haven't created, that's just made by the system. So going back to JDBC, all right. So now we talked about certain parameters that we need in order to open a connection in our JDBC. And these parameters are driver, URL, username, and password. So you don't really need to memorize them. You can find this information on your MySQL installation file or on the internet. This is the default URL. The default port for MySQL is 3306, so remember that. And then /test, this is the name of your database. We will see very soon today how to create a database. inside MySQL. And basically, every time you open a connection in your URL, you must set the path to whatever database that you want to use. Okay, because otherwise, it won't know which database to connect to, where you want to insert or select your data from. So one place where you can store these information, one way you can use init parameters is to store this information. Okay, because this information may be used in many servlets. Okay, you might need to use these information in multiple places, so it makes sense for you to actually place these as init parameters inside your web.xml. We will see how to do that very soon. But the concept is very similar to the program that we just ran in Eclipse. If you have MySQL, you will have different parameters. If you're using SQL Server, again, obviously your parameters will have different values. Your JDBC driver will be different. Your path will be different. SQL Server is Microsoft based, so you will see that you will have some Windows format of addressing your path. This is a code. You might want to look at this. We will get back to this way of basically accessing information from our model class when we talk about model view controller in a few weeks' time. We will see how we set our model class to access the database. But the third concept that I want to talk about today, so I mentioned it before. We talked about servlet config. We saw how we can use init parameters in servlet config, but we have a different object called servlet context. And there is a very crucial difference between a servlet context and a servlet config object that we're going to see. So servlet context, you can think of it as an interface to assist us with communication with the servlet container. Okay. The difference between servlet context and servlet config is that servlet context, there's only one servlet context for the entire application. Okay. But if you have 3 servlets in your application, every servlet can have a servlet config. Okay, so please remember the difference between servlet context and servlet config. We will reiterate that in the next slide, so you will have time to basically learn to be very clear about their difference. The information in servlet context will be common across your web application components, because there is only one servlet context, and that will be shared by all servlets and all JSPs in your web application. So you can actually think of this picture here. In this picture, you have servlet A, servlet B, and servlet C. You have 3 servlets, 1 JSP. Okay. Basically, here you can see that there is one and only one servlet context, and every component, be it a servlet or a JSP, will have access to servlet context object. So basically, servlet context is shared between all components of your web application. However, servlet config, on the other hand, will be associated to every single servlet. So servlet B does not have access to the servlet config that is associated to this servlet. Every servlet will have its own servlet config. Also JSP, this is what we saw in the first half. We saw those init parameters that we defined for the JSP and our servlet. So this, if you remember the concept of global and local variable in your C programming, this can clearly tell you the difference between servlet config and servlet context. So can anybody tell me, so these are the global variables. Let me just tell you this before I ask my question. So these are our global variables, A and B. And we have a local variable here inside the main method, right? Answer is your local variable, which means it can only be accessed locally, right? But these global variables can be accessed from any method. It can be accessed here, it can be accessed there, or if you have multiple methods, they can be accessed everywhere. Now, my question is, which one describes servlet context? Is servlet context similar to a global variable, or is it similar to a local variable? I'm talking about servlet context. Anybody knows the answer? This is the question. Any answer? So if I go back to this question, right, you can see the servlet context is shared between all the components, which means servlet context is similar to which variable? Okay, servlet context is similar to a global variable because it can be shared across different components here. But servlet config is similar to a local variable, right? Because it can only be accessed locally. Servlet A can only access the servlet config that is defined for servlet A, and likewise, servlet B can only access the servlet config that is defined for servlet B. Okay. So that is very clear. The question is, how do we set and how do we get these servlet context parameter? It is very simple. I will demonstrate that to you. So you can see that for context parameter, because context parameters are not associated to any servlet, therefore they're not defined inside any servlet. So if I go back to my Eclipse here, if I want to create, so this init parameter is a servlet config parameter. If I want to create a servlet context, I should go outside the servlet elements. And here we say context param. Okay. And then very similar to servlet config, we'll have param name and param value. Okay, so the key is that context is not associated to any servlet, and therefore it must be declared outside the servlet elements. Okay, so let's go back to the slide and find out how we can retrieve them from our servlets. Okay, so this is the way we can use our config and get servlet context and access init parameters in there. Okay, so that's very simple. There is a demo for it. So let's see the difference again between servlet context and servlet config here. So context init parameter, right? We have it's directly inside web app, but servlet elements is associated to servlet config is associated to a particular servlet, and it goes inside the servlet elements. So as there is a difference between them inside web.xml, there is also a difference between them when we want to retrieve them, right? So getting a servlet config parameter, we use this command, get servlet config. Here we use get servlet context, which is self-explanatory. These applications, these parameters can be shared between all the components of your web application. This is not shared. Servlet init parameters are not shared. Here is another example. If you want to give it any description, there is a tag, there is an element called description, but the main parameters are are name and value. Oh, sorry. By mistake, I clicked on the email. I hope I didn't do it again. Anyway, so let me close this. We don't need that. Okay. Don't know what the problem is now. Okay, fine. So you can think of init parameters as deploy time constants. What does that mean? That means that you can get them at runtime, but you can't really set them. So we don't have a method called set init parameter because these init parameters are only set manually, right? So you can set their values here, but you can't set them inside you can't set these values inside your servlet or inside your JSP. You can only get them, Okay, so that's why we call them deploy time constants. You can't set them, you can only get them. What are attributes? Attributes are like objects pinned to a notice board. Um, Somebody put it there, and the questions are who can access those attributes and how long they live. So this is the scope of different attributes. Last week we saw how to set an attribute for a request object. If you remember request.set attributes, we learned when we were talking about Java beans, use bean. Context attributes are accessible throughout your web application. And when will it cease to exist? When will it stop? When will it get destroyed? When the server goes down or application goes down. We will talk about HTTP session later. Request is only available to the servlet and JSP to which the request is forwarded. Again, something we saw in the last week. How long is it available? The request parameters attributes are available as long as the service method is running by the container. Here's the API for attributes, context, request, and session if you want to go through them. There are differences between attributes and parameters. So for example, we talked about init parameters. Those are attributes. And last week we talked about request attributes. They're very different to parameters. The way they're set is different. We use set attribute here. But to set parameters, we use web.xml file. Attributes return an object. Parameters return a string, and these are the different ways that we can actually get them. So for attributes, we have get attributes. For getting a parameter, we use get init parameter. The methods are also different. So here's the API again, if you want to check. How do we get servlet context attributes in our JSP? It's simple, very simple. We have an implicit object called application. And using application, we can access servlet context attributes. So this is what we already talked about, servlet context being global, similar to a global variable. Okay. Application of servlet context, that is a good question. When does servlet context become useful? Okay, so you can think about global variables when these global variables are useful. These are the cases when we need to access something globally. Okay, so if we have username and password parameters, they might only be useful to a login servlet. Okay, but sometimes we have certain parameters that are useful to all servlets and all JSPs. For example, a database connection. Having a database connection and setting it as an attribute to servlet context can be very useful. That will save you a lot of code, because if you have a connection in one place, you can simply get it from all servlets, right? But if you don't have this servlet context, then in every single servlet, wherever you need to use a database, you will actually have to create a new connection. So this will save you a lot of time. So it's a very good idea to create one connection and set as an attribute in the servlet context, right? Which is basically your global object. And you can get it from all your servlets and all your JSPs. Okay, you don't need to create a connection many times in your servlet and in your JSP. But there is an interesting question here. Okay, the question is, there are many servlets and JSP in the web application. We don't know which servlet will run first. Okay. If you're writing a Java class, a normal Java class, you will have a main method, right? You know where does the application start? The beginning of the application, the beginning of compilation is at the main method, right? But in web applications, you don't know which servlet will run, right? It's not like every time a user requests a page, he's going to request a home page, right? You can request a home page, but oftentimes you want to go to a certain page in a web application. So an application programmer doesn't have a way of knowing where the application starts. There is no main method. So if you want to have certain capability to know where the application starts, you will need to use a class and special class called Servlet Context Listener. With the Servlet Context Listener, this is very similar to event-based programming. I don't know if you're familiar with events. For example, you have a click event. If you're doing Windows programming, you will have mouse click events. You will have lots of events, like the way a user interacts with the keyboard. There are certain events. This is the same thing. Once the container initializes the servlet, you will get certain events from the servlet context listener. And if I want to show you an example of servlet context and the steps you need to do. So the first thing in order to create a servlet context listener is to create your context listener. Okay. And then add this information inside your web.xml file. You will need to create an entry for that listener inside the web.xml file. I have an example for that. Let me see where the example is. Servlet context listener. Okay, I think it's here. Yeah. So what you need to do first thing you do is you create a listener. And this is how you create a listener. You choose a listener. You give it a name, whatever name you like. My listener, anything. You go next. And then for servlet context listener, you're going to have to choose this one here. Okay. And once you do that, you will get a listener, you will get a normal class that implements servlet context listener. Okay, and every servlet context listener will have two important methods: context destroyed and context initialized. So if I jump to my code, which I've written before, you will see that I have printed some message here. As soon as the container initializes your servlet, these codes are going to be run. And what I'm doing here is I'm simply printing a message, and then I'm accessing my servlet context parameters that I have defined in my web.xml, and they're here. So for example, here you can define your URL, username, password from MySQL, and then access it here. Okay. So if I run any servlets or any JSP from this project, it doesn't matter what file I'm running, these codes will be run for sure. Because this is about context. This is about servlet context, okay? So let me go to my index, which is within this project, and I run it. There's nothing special here, but what I want to show you is that these lines are actually run here. I'm in context initialized, and the email is this. So basically, I ran this JSP file, and the container created the servlet context object. So therefore, the codes inside my listener were run, and my listener was this one, right? So it printed this, which is here, and then it also retrieved the parameters from web.xml, the servlet context parameters. Okay. So what I want to do now, I just want to demonstrate to you how you can write, how you can create a simple JDBC application. So these are codes that will help you create your listener class. Okay. What I want to do now is I want to show you how you can create a table in SQL. So let's go back to JDBC. So what I'm going to have to do now, if you remember, I stopped my SQL, right? My SQL was stopped, so I'm going to have to start it again by going to MySQL, start MySQL, use the password. Okay, so what I want to do now is to go inside MySQL, -u root, -p, my password, and all right. So in order to create a database, so let me just show you. So we saw the databases, right? But what I want to do, I want to create my own database. Let's say create database, and we call it JSP 2021. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and create that. You can see, okay, one row affected. So now if I type show databases, you will see an extra. You will see my table is here. In order to create a table and insert data, I'm going to get some data to insert from MySQL. So if I go to this web page, getting started with MySQL, there are some examples, there are some data that you can use. There's also guidelines for you to install MySQL and to basically run certain commands there. But what I want to do in order to save time, I want to get these commands to create a table. Okay, so let's say I want to create this table with these columns: ID, name, owner, birth, and then ID is the primary key. Okay, and actually ID will have auto increments, so you don't need to provide value, it increments automatically. I will go back here. Before you create a table, you need to define where you want to put that table, in which database. I'm going to say use JSP 2021. This is where I want to insert my table. So now database changed. Now you can enter your commands. I'm going to paste it, right? I'm going to create a table called cats. It says 0 rows affected because there is no data yet. But if you say show tables, you will be able to see that there actually is a table called cats. Now it's time to insert some data into my cats table. I'm going to get this insert command, which is inserting certain data into my cats. You can see these names here. There are 3 cats, 3 names. We're not providing ID because ID is defined as auto increment. So I will go back here and I will copy this insert command, enter 3 duplicates, 3 rows affected. There's 0 warning. There's 0 duplicates, okay? The 3 records. All right, so now let's go back to Eclipse and we see how we can actually access JSP there. So I'm going to close everything else. And I'm going to create a new application, dynamic web project, JDBC demo, next. I don't need a web.xml file. So earlier I have told you to copy your jar file if inside your library in Tomcat. If you have done that step, you will see that when you go to libraries, you will see that MySQL jar file is somewhere here. Let me find it. Right here. And this is 80.23. This is the jar file I copied. If you have not copied that, you will not be able to write SQL commands here. There is another way to add this jar file is by going there, going to run configuration. You can either go to run configuration, to class path, add a jar file, or you can go to project properties. You can find where is it? Java builds path. I think it's, yeah, that's right. You can add an external jar file. You can go to wherever your MySQL is. Mine is here. You can add it to your project. Fine, but I have already added mine. So I'm going to go ahead and create a servlet. We call it JDBC or database connect. Actually, not here. It's my class name. DB connect next. Next. Finish here. So what I'm going to do something very simple. The first thing you need to do is you have to run this class, write this command. This is where you write the name of your driver. This is the name of your driver that you need to do. No com.mysql.cj.jdbc.driver. Okay. We need to have try and catch here, okay, because there's a chance that there will be exceptions, okay. So I'm going to surround it with try catch. All right. Next thing, you need to define a connection object. This is how you do it. Driver manager dot get connection. You will need to know URL, username, and password. Okay. So here is the URL: jdbc colon mysql local host. This is the default port 3306. What was the name of the database I created? You need to know the name of the database. It's JSP 2021. Okay, JSP 2021. This is the full path of my URL. Then you need to know your username and password. My username is root. The password I set is JSP_20. Well, normally I'm not supposed to tell you these information, but for the sake of the class, I made a very simple, non-secure instance where I can share the password, but you shouldn't share that. We need to import java.connection from this package, java.sql, not the other ones. Okay, so please remember that. And now we need to have, well, I'm going to add exception to the existing catch clause. Okay, the next thing you have to do is to create a statement to write your statements, whatever your statements are. This is how you do it. You will need the connection, create statements. Let's see what the problems are. I have to import it from java.sql. Okay, so this one's fine. Then next thing is you need to run statements. You need to execute a query. Okay, so execute query. I want to select the data, do a very simple thing. Select star from my table, which is called cats, right? If you remember. And then I'm going to store the result in another object called result set, rs result set. I have to import that also. And then I'm going to use a while loop just to go through the elements here. Very simple. Okay, so I'm going to print it to my browser, response.getWriter.println. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to print the first row, the first column, because it's an integer, right? Remember, the first column is an integer in cats. Is an ID, right? An ID is an integer. Okay, so it has to be an integer. I'm going to say rs.getInt and column number 1. Then I will add a space, and the next one is the name of the cat. So I'm going to say rs.getString, column number 2, add another space, do the same thing, rs.getString. Again, the next one is a string, column number 3. Okay. There we go. So I think everything is fine here. So let me just run this application and make sure it works. We should get 3 names, right? We have 3 cats. We should get the names of these cats. We should get Sandy, Cookie, and Charlie. Okay, so let's go ahead, have a try. I hope I have written everything correctly. Finish. Okay, so here they are. Integer, the ID, name of the cat, Sandy, Cookie, and Charlie. If you have any questions regarding SQL, JDBC, or anything, you can reach me out on QQ. Thank you all for coming to the class. I'm going to stop the recording and I will take any answers that you might have. But goodbye for now. I'll be in touch with you on QQ.